The roar of a ferocious bombardment breaks the silence on the shores of southern France. The recent memory of what happened in Normandy makes the hearts of Nazi soldiers race. Meanwhile, thousands of Allied fighters see the explosions as they glide through the water aboard a powerful naval fleet. The objective: to definitively eliminate the German invaders. On land, the troops of the Third Reich can't believe their eyes. The enemy has inflicted enormous casualties on their ranks in the north, and now they must prepare to counter an approaching overwhelming force. Amid the thunderous sounds, the first boat touches the beach, and a new battle for French territory has just begun. In this new military history video, we delve into the trenches of Operation Dragoon, the key mission that led Hitler to the worst day of his life.
It's summer 1944. Allied airmen, sailors, and soldiers prepare for the invasion of Europe. Their mission is to secure a beachhead, break out, and liberate occupied France. But this isn't June 6, 1944. It's August 15th, and the massive invasion fleet is not heading for Normandy, but for the warm beaches of southern France.
Overshadowed by Operation Overlord, or D-Day, the Provence landings did not leave a deep mark on the collective memory. However, it had an equally significant impact on the history of World War II. This invasion, carried out on August 15, 1944, represented a milestone in the liberation of France and in the final offensive against Nazi Germany, dealing a devastating blow to the Wehrmacht and facilitating the advance toward the heart of the Third Reich. Initially, Operation Dragoon was conceived as part of a larger plan to land in France with the full force of Allied power, attacking from two fronts. Its original name was Anvil, and it was intended to coincide with the naval assault on Normandy, then known as Sledgehammer. However, limited resources led the High Command to decide to focus on a single location. Thus, D-Day was carried out on June 6th. The success of that day is indisputable. The sacrifice of thousands of soldiers opened the doors to Europe held captive by Adolf Hitler. But the French were not willing to allow German troops to regroup and maintain their presence in the country. They wanted to be free, and it was the perfect time to finish off a weakened enemy. To do so, they had to resume Operation Anvil and reclaim the nation. However, not all the Allies agreed.
British Prime Minister Winston Churchill opposes the operation and feels the forces for Anvil would be better used pushing through the Ljubljana Gap towards Vienna. This would allow Allied troops to enter the Balkans and perhaps limit Soviet gains.
In those days, Churchill seemed to have forgotten about Hitler. Confident of victory, he was already looking beyond, toward the post-war period and the challenge of containing communism and its influence. The Red Army was advancing from the Eastern Front and was certain to reach Berlin before the Western troops. If Stalin claimed victory over Nazism, his dominance could be a headache for the British and Americans. The Prime Minister's idea was to send the troops that would be used in the landing to reinforce the units gaining ground from Italy toward the German capital. Although his word was respected within the Allied forces, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower remained focused on seeking victory in the war that was unfolding at the time. Without it, there would be no future to worry about. He knew that new ports were necessary, as the ones established in Normandy did not allow for the arrival of all the supplies needed to sustain the war effort against the Third Reich. That was why the American insisted on continuing with the strategy of launching a new landing from southern France, and he was not the only one.
Also pushing for Anvil is French Committee of National Liberation leader Charles de Gaulle. He's eager to use French forces and demands a French general lead the overall operation. The US refuses, but promises that French forces will liberate Toulon and Marseille and eventually be formed into a separate army.
Ultimately, despite objections, the plan was approved and the mission was renamed Operation Dragoon. It had three main objectives: to liberate southern France and its key ports of Marseille and Toulon, to pressure the German forces to accelerate their withdrawal, and to facilitate connection with the troops in Normandy, consolidating the Western Front. It was the first days of August 1944, and the recent success of D-Day filled the Allied troops with optimism. Meanwhile, at the Allied headquarters, Adolf Hitler received an intelligence report about the possibility of his enemy making another incursion into French soil. This presented the Führer with a dilemma. With the bulk of his forces concentrated in Normandy and the Eastern Front, reinforcing the Mediterranean coast seemed impossible. Nevertheless, Hitler ordered the German 19th Army, in charge of the defense, to resist to the last bullet instead of retreating strategically. This represented an enormous risk, as the force commanded by General Friedrich Wiese was at a clear disadvantage. Its troops were few, poorly supplied, and mostly made up of inexperienced recruits. Furthermore, air support was almost non-existent due to Allied superiority. As if that weren't enough, coastal defenses were insufficient, and many artillery batteries were outdated. However, despite all this, the order from Berlin was clear: resist no matter the cost. And when the sound of the bombing began, the Nazis found themselves with no alternative. The assault on August 15, 1944, began with a massive aerial and naval bombardment aimed at destroying German fortifications and positions. Thousands of Allied aircraft circled the coast, dropping explosives and paratroopers at strategic points inland. During the early hours of the morning, the Allied fleet, composed of more than 1,500 ships, began the landing on a stretch from Saint-Tropez to Cannes. German resistance was limited compared to the fierce defense in Normandy, but engagement still occurred at key points. The first soldiers to reach the shore were Americans from the 36th Infantry Division, followed by British and French troops. The latter, who had not played a leading role in the assault during Operation Overlord, would have a major impact on Dragoon, being the country that contributed the most troops to the mission. This was achieved primarily with the support of their colonies, as most of the combatants were of African origin. The battle was underway, and the Nazis were determined to fight to the bitter end, as ordered. Despite being at a disadvantage, they were better prepared in some areas, and their artillery was more effective. The Allies had divided the beaches into sectors, Alpha, Delta, and Camel. Each had different points marked by color. It was one in particular that faced the greatest challenge.
In the Camel sector, Camel Red Beach provides a more significant obstacle. Located on the Gulf of Fréjus, potential landing beaches in this area are limited by the harbor and cliffs. The beaches available to the Allies are heavily fortified with German sea mines, tank traps, barbed wire, a deep anti-tank ditch, artillery, and machine guns.
The Nazis fortified this location, even with 220mm guns, due to its great strategic importance. Camel Red was also one of the crucial assault beaches, as the city met two main roads leading to the heart of France, and it was also located near a German airbase. When Allied minesweepers approached the coast, enemy artillery forced them back before they could complete their task. The pre-invasion bombardment also did little to suppress the defenders in that corner due to the large number of fortifications, and the landing craft were left completely unprotected. Had the assault continued there, the casualties could have meant tragedy for the forces of Operation Dragoon, so the U.S. command ordered the troops to move to Camel Green, where the beach had already been secured.
There is very little resistance to the landings this day, and those invading take but 183 casualties. The Germans in the south of France have Friedrich Wiese's 19th Army, made up of 7 pretty poor quality infantry divisions, 4 of them static divisions without mobile assets. It does have the better trained and equipped 11th Panzer Division, but this army covers the entire south and east of France, and they are nowhere near enough to stop this invasion.
Beyond the resistance on the fortified Camel Red Beach, the German effort seems to be in vain. Even the Allies are shocked by the weakness of their opponents. The fragile defense of Hitler's men is devastated by the power of thousands of advancing soldiers, spitting fire from their lethal weapons. At every step, they come across more and more Nazi corpses. These were all those combatants who blindly followed the Führer's orders to the bitter end. However, After several hours of horror in which the enemy unleashed a veritable hell from the skies, the sea, and the land, the German spirit finally broke. Little by little, they began to abandon their weapons and surrender to the truth. Defeat was near.
German morale on the continent finally appears to be cracking.
The best German units were on the Eastern Front and fighting in northern France. So a lot of the troops in southern France were not the very best troops in the German army. And over 2,000 of them surrendered on the first day of strong fighting. Even more surrendered the next day.
The Allied advance was relentless, and by August 20th, French forces under the command of General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny were at the gates of Toulon, ready to deliver the grand blow. They launched a fierce offensive on the city, facing a German garrison that had retreated to the remaining fortifications and was well entrenched. The intense and brutal urban fighting continued for 5 days. Tank and artillery attacks reduced various corners to rubble, but the city was liberated. Simultaneously, another contingent advanced on Marseille, where the French resistance had already begun an insurrection. The combination of Allied attacks and internal uprisings led to the German surrender, which took place on August 28th and consolidated a key victory.
In both Toulon and Marseille, the Germans fall back to fortified positions. Allied commanders urge caution, but exuberant crowds urge the French troops on against a demoralized enemy.
The two most important ports in the region had been secured and would be crucial to keeping the troops behind Hitler strengthened. All was optimistic, but it was not yet time to celebrate. Many Germans were still determined to continue fighting. After taking control of Toulon and Marseille, the Allies' advanced into the interior of France, toward Montelimar. There, the remnants of the German 19th Army attempted to establish a defensive line. This would be the scene of one of the fiercest battles of the campaign. American armored vehicles collided with retreating Wehrmacht columns, attempting to escape toward Alsace. For days, close-quarters fighting and airstrikes decimated the Nazi forces, forcing them into a disorderly retreat. By the end of August, the Allies had inflicted enormous losses on the enemy, capturing tens of thousands of German soldiers. Hitler's strategy of holding out to the bitter end proved to be a catastrophic error, and by September 14th, 1944, the forces of Operation Dragoon had linked up with Patton's advancing army from Normandy, closing the trap for the Third Reich soldiers, who could only seek some loophole through which to escape and return to their country.
The Wehrmacht suffered one of the most complete and destructive defeats in military history. The Argenton-Falaise Gap was an escape route for some German units, but a gauntlet of fire and death for many more. For the Germans, fighting at Falaise meant sitting under a 24-hour rain of steel and high explosives on a rolling landscape without much in the way of cover.
Thus, the liberation of France accelerated, and Operation Dragoon, although overshadowed by Normandy, proved to be a decisive victory in World War II. Even the day it began went down in history as the worst day of the Führer's life.
Hitler is later reported as saying that August 15, 1944 was the worst day of his life. And the German situation in Normandy had certainly deteriorated in the last 48 hours. Finally, as if Normandy was not a big enough problem in the West, that morning the Allies had landed forces on the Mediterranean coast.
The rapid conquest of southern France facilitated the Allied advance and sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The landings, urban clashes in Toulon and Marseille, and the battle at Montelimar paved the way for German decline. The war in Europe had entered its final phase. Within Germany, the news of the defeat increased the sense of hopelessness among the population and the military. For many, the battle was lost, although Hitler still refused to accept reality. With France liberated and the Allies advancing from both the East and the West, the fall of Nazism was only a matter of time. And so we come to the end of our video. If you'd like to learn more about operations like Dragoon, which, although less famous, changed the course of history, we invite you to subscribe and join us for our upcoming installments.